Slice open a mud-caked sugar beet and it looks nothing like the white crystals in a kitchen bowl. Yet, during the Napoleonic Wars, European governments tried to replace a tropical, ocean-spanning sugar industry with this cold climate root. The crystal was chemically the same. Everything needed to produce it was different: crop, machinery, labor, transport, and policy. When wartime scarcity drove sugar prices upward, Napoleon ordered vast areas planted and factories built. The first campaign missed most of its targets. Then peace returned, cane sugar came back, and the young beet industry nearly disappeared. So why did a failed emergency substitute later remake European agriculture and challenge cane across world markets? The answer is how war forced Europe to assemble an industrial system around a plant not yet ready for the job. The product at the center of this story is ordinary table sugar, purified sucrose crystallized from the storage root of a specially selected white beet. It is not the red beetroot sold as a vegetable, although both belong to the same domesticated species. It is also not every sweetener Europeans tried during the blockade. Grape syrup, starch sugar, honey, and maple products enter only where they reveal why beet succeeded. Our trail begins with a laboratory crystal in 18th century Prussia, passes through wartime France, and ends when beet becomes a durable European industry in the 19th century. The familiar version gives Napoleon the starring role. Britain blocked colonial sugar, Napoleon ordered beets, and Europe discovered a new source of sweetness. Every part contains a fragment of truth. Together, they hide the central problem. Chemists had isolated sugar from beet more than 60 years before the imperial decrees. Napoleon's vast planting targets largely failed, and when the emergency ended, most early factories could not compete. War did not hand Europe a ready-made alternative to cane. It exposed everything still missing between a sweet root and a cheap white crystal. That distinction matters because finding sugar inside a plant is not the same as building a sugar industry. The real transformation required people to redesign the plant, synchronize fields with factories, learn to recover small dissolved substance from tons of wet roots, and keep the system alive when imported cane became cheap again. The first clue lies not in a European field, but in the oceanic system that field was supposed to replace. By the late 18th century, Europe's sugar habit already reached far beyond aristocratic banquets. Tea, coffee, chocolate, preserves, medicines, and confectionery pulled sugar into the routines of urban consumers across social classes, even though access remained unequal. European refineries could whiten and finish raw sugar, but the plant itself demanded tropical or subtropical conditions. For France and other maritime powers, sweetness therefore arrived by ship. A bowl on a European table depended on distant cane fields, mills, boiling houses, merchants, credit, navies, and imperial law. That supply was inseparable from coerced labor. On Caribbean sugar estates, enslaved Africans and their descendants cultivated cane and worked an industrial process under violent conditions. Cut cane deteriorated quickly, so it had to move from field to mill and boiling house without delay. Plantations joined agriculture and manufacturing in one tightly timed unit. This was not merely a farm exporting a crop, it was a factory landscape whose profitability rested on chattel slavery, colonial control, and the forced movement of people across the Atlantic. The most important French example was Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. On the eve of its revolution, it was the world's leading sugar producer. Its output helped make sugar abundant in French ports and profitable in European trade. But that output depended on one of the Atlantic world's most brutal slave regimes. In 1791, enslaved people began the uprising that became the Haitian Revolution. The plantation order broke apart, France lost its most valuable sugar colony, and independent Haiti emerged in 1804. The disruption sent prices upward in France years before Napoleon's Beet campaign. Yet this did not end Europe's access to cane. Production expanded elsewhere, including British Caribbean islands and Cuba. French merchants could still seek colonial sugar from other sources. What changed in the Napoleonic period was the ability to move it. Britain dominated the sea. Napoleon tried to bar British goods from the European continent through the continental system. Britain answered and extended restrictions on trade with French-controlled ports. Smuggling continued, enforcement varied, and sugar never vanished absolutely. But the commercial war made overseas goods scarcer and much more expensive across large parts of continental Europe. The first answer was already 64 years old. In 1747, Berlin chemist Andreas Sigismund Marggraf had isolated crystallizable sucrose from beet. The blockade did not reveal a new kind of sugar, it made an old, commercially useless result suddenly strategic. French price evidence captures the pressure. Relative to textiles, sugar during the blockade years of 1807 to 1812 stood more than 50% above its average after the war. In German price data, the wartime gap was far larger. A familiar consumer good had become a strategic vulnerability. The obvious response might have been to find another shipping route. The more radical response was to move the biological source of sugar itself from tropical cane to a route that could survive a European winter. There was only one problem. The route then available was not yet the sugar beet we know today. Marggraf had reported that several European routes contained crystallizable sugar. Beet mattered most. By crushing and extracting the root, then allowing the liquid to yield crystals, he demonstrated that its sweetness was not merely a vague syrup, it was the same kind of sugar obtained from cane. At the molecular level, the future substitute was already present. Marggraf's result was scientifically important and commercially disappointing. Contemporary beets held little sugar compared with later specialized varieties. Their juice also carried water, salts, coloring matter, and other compounds that complicated crystallization. A laboratory could sacrifice time, alcohol, and carefully handled samples to display a few crystals. A merchant needed tons of roots, reliable machinery, cheap fuel, skilled workers, and a product that could meet cane sugar on price. With an existing colonial trade supplying Europe, there was little economic reason to build that system around beet. This is the first broken intuition. The decisive discovery was not that beet tasted sweet, it was that a chemist could identify and crystallize sucrose from it. But even that answer changes the question rather than closing it. If the chemistry was known in 1747, why did commercial production wait another half-century? Franz Karl Aschar supplied part of the missing answer. A student and successor of Marggraf, Aschar did not treat all beets as identical. He compared forms, selected roots with white flesh, a conical shape, and sweeter juice, and propagated the better material. The pale Silesian type associated with this work contained roughly 4 to 6% sugar. That was still modest beside modern hybrids, which can exceed 18% under favorable conditions, but selection had begun to turn a multi-purpose fodder root into industrial raw material. Aschar also pushed beyond the specimen jar. With Prussian royal support, he established a beet sugar works at Cunern in Silesia around 1801, with production underway by 1802. Roots had to be cultivated, cleaned, reduced to pulp, pressed, clarified, concentrated, and persuaded to form crystals. The factory proved that the chain could operate beyond a laboratory. It did not prove that the chain could reliably beat cane sugar. Early yields were low, equipment was temperamental, and the venture remained financially fragile. Napoleon did not invent beet sugar. Marggraf established the chemistry. Aschar joined selection to manufacturing and circulated practical knowledge. What Napoleon supplied was not the original idea. He supplied an emergency large enough to make governments ignore the cost. If you enjoy seeing familiar foods rebuilt from evidence rather than legend, subscribe. Many ordinary ingredients are hiding industrial revolutions. A Shah's factory also revealed a constraint that would govern the entire industry. Sugar was only a small fraction of a heavy, watery root. Early French processors recovered about 2 or 3 kilograms of sugar from 100 kilograms of beet. That meant carts had to move enormous weights for a small return. If fields lay too far from a factory, transport consumed the margin. If roots waited too long, deterioration reduced the recoverable sugar. A successful beet industry could not consist of scattered farmers selling a durable commodity whenever convenient. It required a regional machine, selected seed, intensive cultivation, short roots, synchronized harvesting, and factories ready at the exact moment the crop arrived. Prussia had demonstrated the possibility. War would now test whether a state could order the machine into existence. France did not leap immediately from sugar shortage to beet. Investigators tested domestic sources, including grapes and other plants. French chemists repeated and confirmed Achard's work, while entrepreneurs began adapting it. In the northern city of Lille, Louis Crespel de Lys opened an early beet sugar factory in 1810. Around Paris, Benjamin Delesseur worked to produce convincing loaves of refined beet sugar. These were not acts of imperial creation. They were local attempts to translate Prussian knowledge into French crops, workers, and equipment. In 1811, the French state tried to accelerate the translation. Napoleon's government called for about 32,000 hectares of beet across the empire, supported experimental schools, scholarships, rewards, and processing works. On paper, the order attacked every missing link at once. More fields would feed more factories. Schools would produce trained technicians. Official backing would attract capital. A domestic crop would weaken dependence on hostile shipping. But a decree can allocate hectares more quickly than it can produce seed, experience, or trust. The planting order arrived late for the season. Suitable seed was scarce and sometimes absent. In some districts, farmers had little experience with the crop or even with recognizing its young plants. They hesitated to weed aggressively because they feared pulling out the beet itself. Some roots grew where no processor could take them. Some factories stood where farmers had not supplied enough roots. Carts and roads failed to connect the two. Beets waited, decayed, and lost value. Machinery broke or performed badly, and workers were learning a new process while production was already expected. The result exposes the difference between a target and a harvest. Only about 6,800 to 7,000 hectares were planted, roughly 1/5 of the proposed area. The national experiment did not fail because farmers were irrational or because beet sugar was fraudulent. It failed because the government had treated acreage as if it were the industry. The roots needed a network, and the network did not yet exist. There were real successes. Northern France came closest to its targets because beet was already familiar in some local rotations. Agricultural societies followed experiments abroad, and towns such as Lille, Douai, and Valenciennes concentrated merchants, roads, canals, and processing attempts. In the Nord department, beet acreage expanded sharply during the imperial years. The geography was teaching officials what the decree had missed. Factories had to sit close to fields, and both needed capital, fuel, transport, manure, and practiced labor. Then Delesseur produced the object Napoleon needed to see. In early 1812, loaves of beet sugar reached the emperor. The product looked like the colonial commodity the government was trying to replace, and Napoleon rewarded Delesseur with the Legion of Honor. The image later helped compress a complicated history into a single heroic scene. Emperor sees sugar, emperor creates industry. In reality, the white loaf was proof of quality, not proof of economic survival. The government responded with still larger ambitions. A new program envisioned 5 imperial factories, hundreds of private works, and 100,000 hectares of beet. Again, actual performance fell far below the plan. Of hundreds of authorized ventures, only 158 were reported operating, and output reached about 1.1 million kilograms. Substantial evidence that beet sugar could be made, but only around a third of the official expectation. Even those shortfalls produced something valuable. Farmers learned which soils and methods suited the root. Workshops tested cutters, pressers, clarifiers, and boiling equipment. Chemists and manufacturers trained people who carried knowledge beyond a single plant. Officials discovered that a sugar factory could not be placed like a monument. It had to be embedded in an agricultural district. Failed batches revealed where sugar was being lost. Pulp and molasses suggested byproducts that could improve the economics. War was paying for an unusually large, disorderly industrial trial. By 1813 and 1814, Europe had not escaped cane. Beet remained expensive, uneven, and dependent on wartime conditions. But it had crossed a line Margraaf's crystal never could. Hundreds of growers and processors had handled the crop under production pressure. If scarcity continued, the system might keep learning. Then the war ended, and the market delivered its verdict. After Napoleon's defeat and the reopening of French ports in 1814, colonial sugar returned. Prices that had risen to 3 or 4 francs per old French pound fell to about 80 centimes. The precise burden varied by place and grade, but the direction was devastating. Beet factories designed for an emergency suddenly faced a mature tropical product sold through restored commercial networks. Many closed. Capital was lost. The apparent miracle of wartime self-sufficiency became an expensive reminder that technical possibility and competitive production were not the same thing. The blockade had not simply created Europe's beet sugar industry. It had protected an unfinished system from the comparison that mattered. Once peace restored cane, the first industry largely collapsed. Napoleon's experiment looked less like a founding triumph than a temporary shelter. Yet, collapse did not erase the knowledge accumulated inside it. Crexel de Lis resumed production in Lille in 1817 and continued working with both the crop and its processing. Other manufacturers retained manuals, machines, trained workers, and contacts with growers. Northern farmers had seen beet fit into intensive rotations and had found value in its leaves and pulp as animal feed. The wartime system could not survive unchanged, but its pieces remained available. The problem after 1815 was therefore sharper than before. Europe no longer needed proof that beet could become sugar. It needed a reason to keep improving beet when cane was cheaper. That reason came from a combination no single inventor controlled: customs policy, regional agriculture, factory learning, and patient biological selection. Post-war governments did not create a perfectly planned rescue. Import duties already mattered because colonial and foreign sugar were valuable sources of revenue. Domestic beet sugar produced inside the tariff border benefited when imported cane paid duties. The effect was protection, whether every measure had been designed for beet or not. France could therefore preserve a price space in which local producers kept experimenting. In German territories, changes in customs policy later performed a similar function. Beet sugar survived because politics continued to alter the contest between two chemically equivalent products. Protection alone was not enough. The places where beet took hold shared practical advantages. Northern France already had intensive farming, dense towns, available capital, roads and canals, and experience fitting labor-demanding crops into rotations. Beet required deep preparation, manure, careful thinning, and repeated weeding. It rewarded skilled cultivation but punished neglect. Its bulk made transport expensive, so fields clustered around works. Factories, in turn, needed a dependable radius of growers, enough fuel for boiling, and workers available for a seasonal campaign. That proximity changed the countryside. A farmer no longer grew only a root. The farmer supplied a factory, whose calendar and capacity shaped planting decisions. The processor depended on hundreds of agricultural judgments made months before any machine started. Contracts, seed quality, delivery schedules, and tests for sugar content gradually became as important as the extraction apparatus. This was the deeper meaning of transferring tropical sugar to Europe. Cane plantations had united field and mill on one estate. Beet recreated that coordination across networks of independent farms and centralized works. Byproducts helped hold the network together. Once juice was removed, beet pulp could feed cattle and sheep. Leaves could return value to the farm, while molasses and other residues found additional uses. These returns did not turn every venture profitable, but they made the crop more than a container carrying a few kilograms of sugar. Farms that combined livestock, manure, beet, and grain could fit the new industrial crop into an older agricultural cycle. The recovery became visible in the numbers. France counted only 58 beet sugar works in 1828, producing about 6.5 million kilograms of crude sugar. By 1837, the count had reached 585 works and output about 40 million kilograms. The multiplication was not a smooth march of efficient factories. Many works were tiny, experimental, or attached to individual farms. When taxes and duties changed again in the late 1830s, weaker plants closed and production concentrated in the north. Policy had stimulated expansion, then forced consolidation. Inside the surviving factories, repeated small improvements began to matter more than imperial spectacle. Better cutting exposed more tissue. More effective extraction left less sucrose in the pulp. Improved clarification removed substances that interfered with crystallization. More controlled evaporation reduced losses and fuel use. In the Valenciennes area, the amount of sugar recovered from a given weight of beet roughly doubled between 1835 and 1848. No single machine explains that gain. It came from a production culture that measured losses at every stage. The human scale was substantial. In 1845, sugar works in the Nord processed roughly 305 million kilograms of beet into about 15 million kilograms of sugar and employed nearly 10,000 people. Factory employment was seasonal. Records noted that many workers returned to agriculture for the rest of the year. The crop did not eliminate hard labor by moving sugar north. It reorganized labor around sowing, thinning, lifting, carting, slicing, boiling, and a short factory campaign. Selection continued the same work inside the plant. Achar's white Silesian material had begun with roughly 4 to 6% sugar. Over the 19th century, breeders repeatedly chose roots and parent lines that combined higher sucrose with usable yields. Louis de Villemorin's systematic work in the 1850s became an important step in selecting beet specifically for sugar rather than primarily for fodder. Across the longer breeding history, sugar concentration rose to more than 18% in modern hybrids under favorable conditions. That biological change altered every other calculation. More sugar in each root meant fewer tons hauled for the same crystal output, more factory product for each hour of work, and a larger return from the same field. Better machinery made the crop more valuable. A better crop made machinery more economical. Tariffs gave both time to improve. Remove any one part too early and cane won on price. Keep them together long enough and beet ceased to be merely a wartime substitute. France was the crucial testing ground after the first collapse, but the model spread through continental Europe. German states, the Habsburg lands, and the Russian Empire developed their own combinations of agricultural societies, protected markets, estates, growers, and factories. The exact institutions differed. The recurring structure did not. Scientific selection, nearby processing, capital-intensive equipment, and government rules that prevented cheap imported cane from ending the experiment before it matured. By this point, the original question has changed. Europe was no longer asking whether sugar could be extracted from beet. It was building regions in which the crop, the factory, and the tariff made one another possible. And that system possessed an advantage more powerful than any patriotic slogan. The customer did not have to learn to want a new product. Purified sucrose from cane and purified sucrose from beet have the same molecular structure. The plant source can sometimes be inferred from trace impurities or specialized analysis, but the sucrose molecule itself carries no label. In a white crystal, tropical cane and temperate beet converge. That chemical identity explains why the European experiment could grow far beyond a wartime curiosity. Many substitutes ask consumers to accept a different flavor, texture, or use. Beet sugar could enter the same refineries, recipes, shops, and habits as cane sugar. Once quality improved, the substitution happened behind the counter. The visible product stayed familiar, while the invisible system beneath it changed continents. The scale changed quickly. Around 1840, beet supplied only about 5% of world sugar. By 1880, it supplied roughly half. United States Department of Agriculture historical estimates put world beet output at 741,000 tons in 1866 and nearly 6 million tons in 1899, when beet represented about 65% of combined cane and beet production. Continental Europe produced almost all of that beet sugar. A route that had failed Napoleon's first acreage target had become a force in the world market. That rise was not evidence that northern fields were naturally destined to defeat tropical cane. European duties, bounties, and export support repeatedly favored beet. Breeding and engineering then converted that protected time into real productivity. Cane producers also improved mills and boiling technology, expanded into new regions, and fought for protected markets of their own. The global price of an apparently simple crystal emerged from competition between political systems as much as between plants. Nor did beet sugar instantly liberate sugar from slavery. After 1815, French colonial policy again protected cane from Martinique and other islands, where enslaved people continued producing sugar. Competition from beet placed pressure on colonial producers and entered debates about the future of the sugar economy. But France's abolition of slavery in 1848 resulted from enslaved people's resistance, abolitionist campaigns, political change, moral arguments, and economic conditions together. Giving beet the credit would replace human struggle with a comforting technological legend. The opposite simplification is also misleading. Beet cultivation and factory work demanded strenuous, often seasonal labor, but that did not make them equivalent to chattel slavery. The systems differed fundamentally in legal status, coercion, ownership of people, mobility, and violence. The truthful comparison is more precise. Beet shifted part of sugar production into European farms and wage labor factories, while plantation cane continued and expanded elsewhere. It created a rival geography, not an immediate ethical solution. The rivalry also made sugar more deeply industrial. Factory efficiency, crop testing, breeding stations, transport links, tariffs, and export policy became hidden ingredients in every crystal. By the end of the 19th century, a buyer could consume beet sugar without knowing it. That invisibility was the industry's final technical achievement. Europe had not invented a new sweet taste. It had made two radically different production worlds deliver an interchangeable commodity. The legacy remains visible in fields, even when it disappears in the bowl. Current European Union figures place beet at about 1/5 of world sugar production, with cane supplying most of the rest. The EU produces around half of the world's beet sugar, concentrated especially in northern France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Poland. The wartime substitute no longer dominates the global balance as it briefly did, but it still anchors a major temperate zone industry. That persistence brings us back to the dirty root and the white crystals inside it. The maritime crisis did not teach Europe that beet contained sugar. Marggraf had proved that in 1747. It did not give Europe a finished crop. A Shah's selected beet still carried only a fraction of the sugar found in later varieties. And Napoleon's decrees did not create a stable industry. They produced missed planting targets, mismatched fields and factories, spoiled roots, weak machinery, and sugar that survived only while war distorted the market. But the failure mattered. The emergency forced governments, chemists, farmers, mechanics, investors, and workers to test every link at once. When cheap cane returned, it exposed which links were still too weak. Post-war protection kept part of the experiment alive. Northern farming districts tightened the connection between field and factory. Processors recovered more of the sugar already present. Breeders put more sugar into each generation of roots. Over decades, those pieces changed beet from emergency material into an industrial crop. So how did Europe reproduce a tropical sugar industry in a field of beets? It did not copy the plantation plant for plant, it copied the coordination. Cane had tied cultivation to rapid processing on colonial estates. Beet tied selected seed, intensive farms, short transport routes, seasonal factories, scientific measurement, and state policy into a new regional system. The crystal could be identical because everything behind it had been rebuilt. And that is what appears when a mud-caked sugar beet is cut open. Not ready-made white sugar and not Napoleon's invention, but a storage route redesigned by selection and surrounded by an industry designed through failure. The sweetness was inside the beet all along. Making it cheap enough to reach the bowl required Europe to build an entirely new world around the root.